You hear it on the roof first, a soft tap, then another, then 1,000 of them at once. You reach for a blanket, you turn up the heat. Maybe you light a candle that smells like cinnamon. For you, a storm is the best excuse in the world to do nothing at all. 50,000 years ago, that same sound meant something else entirely. It meant get inside. It meant check the fire. It meant someone might not survive the night. You are standing at the mouth of a rock shelter somewhere in what is now the American Midwest, thousands of years before it had that name. The sky has been gray since morning. Now it opens up completely, not a drizzle. A wall of water, the kind that turns dry creek beds into rivers within an hour. Your first thought is not shelter. It is fire, because fire is the difference between a bad night and a dead one. A wet human body loses heat up to 25 times faster than a dry one. That number comes from basic thermal physics. The same reason wet clothing feels so much colder than dry clothing at the exact same air temperature. Without waterproof gear, without walls, a night spent soaked in temperatures most Americans would call mild, somewhere around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, can push a human body into hypothermia before sunrise. You do not need a blizzard to die of cold. You just need to be wet for long enough in the dark. So you protect the fire like it is another member of your family, because in a very real sense, it is. Anthropologist Richard Wrangham has spent decades studying what fire actually did for early humans, and his research points to something most people never consider. Fire did not just keep you warm, it changed what your body was capable of. Cooked food yields far more usable energy than raw food, which means a group with reliable fire could survive on less, recover faster, and put that saved energy into bigger brains and more complex behavior. Losing the fire during a storm was not just uncomfortable. It was a step backward in every sense. The problem is that starting fire from nothing using friction alone is brutally difficult, especially with wet wood, wet tinder, and shaking hands. So groups guarded embers like currency. They wrapped smoldering coals in green leaves. They packed them into a tough, fibrous fungus called tinder fungus, which can hold a spark and smolder quietly for hours without bursting into flame. It is, in a very real sense, one of the first battery packs in human history. We know this was not guesswork because of a man named Ötzi. In 1991, hikers found a frozen body in the Alps, preserved for over 5,000 years by ice. Along with his tools and his clothing, Ötzi carried a complete fire-starting kit: flint, iron pyrite for striking sparks, and tinder fungus, carefully carried just in case. 5,000 years after the storms this story is describing, people were still terrified enough of losing fire that they carried backup equipment for it. Every single day. So the fire survives the storm. Now what? Now you are trapped. The rain outside is not stopping in the next hour. It might not stop for 2 days. And here is the part that surprises most people. This forced stillness may be one of the most important forces in the entire story of who we became. Archaeologist Lynn Wadley has spent years excavating a site called Sibudu Cave in South Africa. And what she found there rewrites the assumption that early humans were only ever scrambling to survive. Inside that cave, dating back roughly 77,000 years, her team found bedding, actual constructed sleeping mats made from layered sedges and rushes with a top layer of leaves from a plant that naturally repels insects. This was not a pile of leaves someone collapsed onto. This was engineering. Someone built comfort on purpose during the exact kind of long, unproductive stretch a storm creates. And it was not only comfort, it was manufacturing. Picture the scene inside that shelter. The fire is doing its job, the rain is doing its worst outside. And around that fire, hands are moving. Someone is knapping stone, carefully, each strike sending off small flakes that pile up in the dirt exactly where they are sitting. Archaeologists find these flake piles concentrated in specific spots inside caves over and over, all across the world. It is the fossil record of patience. Someone else might be twisting fiber. At a site in France called Abri du Maras, researchers found a tiny fragment of twisted plant fiber, evidence of cordage made by Neanderthals, older than almost anything else of its kind ever discovered. Rope does not sound impressive until you realize what it makes possible. Tied shelters, bound tools, traps that let one person do the work of 5. Someone invented that idea while sitting still, waiting for weather to pass with nothing to do but experiment with the plants around them. And then Somewhere in the deepest, driest part of the shelter, something even stranger might be happening. Someone might be creating art. The cave paintings at Chauvet in France are around 36,000 years old, and they are not crude scribbles. They show horses mid-stride, lions with weight shifted onto tensed muscle, animals captured with an eye for movement that took real, sustained observation to develop. These paintings are often located deep inside the cave systems, far past the areas anyone would actually use for shelter, reached only by crawling through narrow passages while carrying a small flame that could go out at any moment. Nobody makes that trip on a good day. You make that trip when the alternative is sitting in the dark with nothing to occupy your mind, and something inside you needs an outlet anyway. Here is where the story turns from survival to something closer to the birth of culture itself. Because when a group is stuck together for 2 or 3 days, something happens that would not happen otherwise. People talk. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner spent years studying the Juhuanzi people of the Kalahari Desert, and she noticed something specific about their conversations. During the day, talk was practical, complaints, logistics, who did what. But at night, gathered around a fire, the subject shifted almost entirely. Over 80% of nighttime conversation turned to stories, songs, and shared history. A storm simply forces that nighttime condition to last longer. It compresses days of scattered activity into one long stretch where the only thing left to do is sit together and talk. And what gets talked about during hours and hours with nothing else pulling anyone's attention is exactly the kind of knowledge that keeps a group alive. Which plants are poisonous? Where water collects even in a drought. What that specific set of clouds usually means. That information does not survive by being written down. It survives because someone repeated it by firelight during the kind of long, forced pause a storm creates, often enough that a child memorized it without even trying. Some of that transmitted knowledge lasted almost unbelievably long. Researchers studying Aboriginal Australian oral traditions have found stories describing coastline changes that match sea level data from roughly 7,000 years ago. Real geological events preserved for thousands of years through nothing but people telling each other stories in exactly the kind of stillness a storm imposes. And once the storm finally breaks, something else becomes true that almost nobody expects. The world outside is not just safe again, it is better than before. Rain softens the ground, and soft ground holds a track perfectly. Every hoofprint, every claw mark sits there clearly for anyone who knows how to read it. Rain fills natural stone depressions with clean water, some of which archaeologists have found deliberately carved deeper to hold more. Rain triggers mushrooms to surface, tubers to loosen in wet soil, and in parts of Africa, it sends termites swarming in massive numbers, an easy, protein-dense meal that needs no tools at all to gather. The storm that nearly killed you also quietly reset the entire landscape in your favor. So the people who walked out of that shelter were not simply the ones who survived. They were the ones who came out with a new tool in their hands, a new coil of rope, a new story that would outlive them, or a new image burned into memory from a wall deep underground. The storm did not steal that time from them. It created it. You will probably watch a storm today from behind a window, wrapped in something warm, thinking about nothing more urgent than what to watch next. And somewhere in the deep architecture of your brain, in the part that still remembers being a species with everything to lose, that feeling of coziness is not new. It is inherited. It is the echo of every person who ever sat by a fire, kept it alive through the worst of the weather, and discovered almost by accident that stillness could build a civilization. The rain outside your window has not changed in 50,000 years. What changed is you no longer have to be afraid of it. And maybe that is the real ending to this story. Not that rain was once a death sentence, but that surviving it again and again is the reason you are here to feel safe enough to enjoy the sound of it now.